I'm doing something like this on Zoom or live like this. Usually when I have a class, it's in person and I can look you all in the eye and and have a conversation one-on-one. So this is a new thing for me, as some of you may have heard earlier. My dog barked, so we'll see. Hopefully he'll be fine for the remainder of this class, but it's a new thing working from home these days. Anyway, I'm going to start this lecture. So the lecture is called Stand Back, Physical Distance and Fashion. And I'm just going to, there we go. So I want to first start with the fact that I'm a costume designer. And as such, fashion and costume design is about the creation of shape and the manipulation of space. So whether it's through padding or hoops or veils or hats or punk spikes, physical distance and fashion have coexisted long before COVID-19. As a costume designer, studying the socioeconomic reasons behind fashion are very much a part of my process, and enter into my study as I start a project. You can put just about any type of clothing on stage and have it be called a costume. But one thing that I really work hard and include as part of my research is the need to explore what an effective costume is. So for me, an effective costume, it visually defines a character portrayed by the actor and helps establish a theme or the idea and mood or atmosphere of a production as interpreted by the director. And in order to do that, it's a process of defining character, which includes setting a character in a time and space, establishing an age, rank, and social status, establishing personality, and reflecting changes that that character may go through. So this is just to give you a bit of background about how I go about doing my research and to give you a bit of a take on what you're about to hear. Unlike historians or sociologists that may work in a higher learning institution and dedicate their time and energies to going to places, have research periods where they're able to go and look at primary research examples. A lot of my research is based on secondary research, which is is a lot of reading from other historians, sociologists, but I also, of course, put my own interpretation to things. And the biggest challenge is just keeping your eyes and ears and mind open. So when I was first asked to do this lecture, it was sort of asked if I would have any ideas about COVID-19 and where we are right now. And at the time, this was in early April. And I was really struck by the amount of memes that were coming online, talking about social distance, fashion, and they're all quite humorous. And of course, now we call it physical distancing as opposed to social distancing. But these are just sort of an example of some of the memes that you can find online. And it got me thinking about the fact that a lot of people who are making these memes or laughing at these memes maybe don't have an understanding of where these fashions came from. What are the reasons that people, and women in particular, had this fashion that made people stand back and give them their distance. So this is going to be a survey sort of discussion, lecture, if you will, about those reasons. We're covering a lot of different time periods and a lot of different topics. So we're going to be skimming over a lot of things. Pretty much every time period that I touch on could easily be a 1.5 hour lecture in and of itself. But let's get started. So in this meme, you can see the pannier skirt and women practicing social distancing since the 17th century. And really, that's a really great segue to bring us to the Spanish farthingale. And the pannier of the 18th century really had its beginnings with the Spanish farthingale, which was found in Europe of the 16th century. Here we have a picture of Catherine Parr, who was the sixth and last wife of King Henry VIII. In the case of volumetric clothing, there's always a sense of visual impact and taking up space, particularly in relation to status. So while we look at physical distancing clothing today as focusing on avoiding pathogens such as germs and viruses, and specifically COVID-19, physical distancing garments of the past were all about defining socioeconomic hierarchy. And here on the image on the left of your screen is probably the earliest depiction of the Spanish farthingale we have in art. It's a painting of Salome, painted in 1470 to 1480. And you can see how the rings of the farthingale helping to keep the shape of the skirt, but you can see them on the outside of the garment. So the Spanish verdugio, which I'm probably murdering my pronunciation of it, so I apologize for that, but it was later called the farthingale, was first made popular by the Queen Consort, Joan of Portugal, and you can see her in the center there. This is an older portrait that was part of a family tree. She was a very controversial personality in the court of Spain. She was thought to be quite a promiscuous woman. She was mentioned as wearing a very low décolleté, and that she had numerous lovers. And it's thought that she started wearing the Spanish farthingale, this stiff skirt, to help hide a pregnancy, specifically an illegitimate pregnancy. But courts being what they are, because she was a woman of power, the fashion took root in the court. And at that time, and for many decades and centuries later, the court sort of dictated where fashion came from. The farthingale was introduced to England by Catherine of Aragon, who was married to, in 1501, to a 15-year-old Arthur, who was Prince of Wales, brother to the future King Henry VIII. Arthur died 5 months after their marriage. But Catherine stayed on in court, and she even held the position of ambassador of the Aragonese crown to England in 1507. So she was the first female ambassador in European history. So she was a woman of power and position in the court. Henry was taken by her, and in 1509, shortly after he came to the throne, they were married. When we think of the court of Henry VIII, and specifically Henry VIII, we have quite a masculine figure. So here was a person, sort of, I call him the original man spreader, if you will. So it was, but his fashion exuded masculinity, wide shoulders. He had lusty appetites, both with women and food. Certainly, he was a sportsman in his early years, and after an injury, became increasingly corpulent as he indulged in food, but didn't necessarily have the ability to wear those calories off. So his clothing under his court became quite large, expansive, square shaped, something that we really identify as masculine. And identify power in that masculine form. And here we see a painting of his family, where he is sitting with his third wife, Jane Seymour, and Prince Edward, who would later become Edward VI. On the left there is Princess Mary, who later became Mary I. And on the right, we have Elizabeth, who of course became Elizabeth I. So again, just to sort of set the scene and give a bit of background, there are many intrigues and reasons between Catholicism and Protestantism, and the struggle for power at this time, which we don't really have time to get into. But you can see that it was a very masculine based court at that time. And here we have pictures of Queen Elizabeth I as she came to power. She ruled England between 1558 and 1603, starting as a young woman, which you can see in her coronation portrait. And then the portrait on the right is towards the end of her reign. Elizabeth cleverly used clothing and her image to cement power and excite adoration of her people at a time when most people couldn't read. Visual meaning was therefore especially important. And she used her clothing and portraiture as a sort of self-made mythology. Her clothes were her canvas, and she could use them not only to demonstrate her power and the opulence of the extent of her reign, but also use them with the embroidery to tell stories. What it's interesting to notice sort of that one of her lasting contributions to fashion are her use of pearls. And it can be pictured wearing pearls in portraiture from as early as when she was 13 years old. Pearls, of course, symbolize purity and chastity. And as the Virgin Queen, they were a powerful symbol in her portraits. As Elizabeth matured in her reign, female fashions became even more geometrical and square-shaped, the most square-shaped really in history, and they heavily borrowed from masculine styles. In 1577, the French farthingale, which was like the Spanish farthingale, which was conical shaped, moved to a more rounded shape at the top. It had the addition of a roll, and you can see that shape on the left-hand side of your screen. It was first brought to England in 1577 by the English ambassador to Paris, stating that this was now the new undergarment worn by the French queen. There is some rumor that this was to disguise the queen's expansive hips, which still bulged at the top of the Spanish farthingale. And it's interesting to note that it's at this time that we also have the first written example of men complaining that the French farthingale was keeping would-be lovers at a distance. And this is a trend that you will see repeated every time women wear fashion that takes up space. And this is a comparison just to look at how women take up space versus men in this time period. In this this portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, the French farthingale, she's wearing the French wheel farthingale, or otherwise known as the Great Farthingale. And this could be either stiffened with reeds, with the actual hoop, or a heavy canvas. It came into the fashion in the 1590s, so towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. And they were measured at as wide as 4.5 feet, or 1.4 meters wide. It's interesting to note here that Elizabeth, who has still remained unmarried and is still considered the Virgin Queen, is wearing an open neck, the low décolletage. So she's presenting herself still as unmarried and alluring in that regard. But with the wheel farthingale, she's unattainable. And this, I think, particularly as who was going to come to the throne after her reign became a greater question. I found this a really interesting tactic or fashion ploy. Some historians have suggested that the paintings of Elizabeth and the size of her wheel farthingale were exaggerated. But again, this is not uncommon when you look at people talking about the space that women in power take up. And I want to use this next slide to discuss that. So we have the example of King Henry VIII, Elizabeth's father, and the expanse of his shoulders and the squareness of his shape, and how Elizabeth feminized that and with her own sort of expansive, square, geometrical shape, taking up an enormous amount of space in the room as power. And the image in the center is it's called the Saxony Ensemble, and it's from somewhere between 1547 to 1553. So we can see that there's really no exaggeration from what we see depicted on King Henry VIII. So although none of Elizabeth's dresses have survived, here's an example of a period garment that illustrated the expanse of the garments. So if men's fashions weren't exaggerated, is it possible that women's fashions were not exaggerated either? Moving on to a post-Elizabeth world. This is an image of Anne of Denmark. painted between 1605 and 1610. And Anne was the wife of James I, who was the reigning monarch after Elizabeth. You can see here that the wheel farthingale remained. It remained tilted up at the back, which helped lengthen the front of the garment at the waist and shortened the legs. And there was an emphasis on seeing the foot and shoe in this time period. Eventually, the wheel was replaced by hip pads for the remainder of the 17th century. And here you can see that by the 1620s, the hoops and hip rolls began to vanish. And we really moved into what was called the Cavalier period. And again, this is a topic that can take on a life of its own. But it's worth pointing out that the silhouettes of women at the first part of the 17th century really softened to almost as though they were being caught in their boudoir mid-dress, with the exception of the Spanish court. And you can see the Infanta on the right-hand side of your screen. And it was in the Spanish court where there was a conservative reluctance to forget the past and to accept new artistic styles. So the Spanish court kept the stiff farthingale alive and well throughout the 17th century. And here, the farthingale evolved into a broader, a more elliptical shape, which was really the forerunner to the panier of the 18th century. Before we move on to the paniers of the 18th century, it's worth sort of noting where we ended up at the end of the 17th century. And as in the court of, specifically of Louis XIV. So as he's known as the Sun King, and we often have images of him as this great patron of the arts and ballet. But as he grew older, he became more and more religious. And fashions at court became more rigid and more vertical. And I like to think of it as the time period where, you know, the taller the fontange, which was the collection of lace at the top of your head, the closer to God, as though he was creating all these little antennae to God towards the end of his lifespan. The portrait that you see on the left-hand side of your page there is a family portrait from 1709. His queen died in 1683, but the king secretly married Madame de Maintenon, who was the governess to his illegitimate children and who had been his lover for many, many years. She was incredibly pious and religious, and she gained a lot of political influence in court. So there she is pictured on the far left-hand side of the screen. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the mantua and again, just the rigid verticality of fashion as we edge slowly into the 18th century. So it's really with the death of King Louis XIV in 1715 and the start of the French Regency that life moves away from the court of Versailles, and we see a real relaxation of fashion and the introduction of the robe volant and the robe à la française, which or otherwise known as the sack-back gown. And it was a much looser, more flowing garment. At this time in England, there was the death of Queen Anne, and she was the last of the Stuart monarchs. And it's led to a new dynasty, which was the House of the Hanovers, 1714, and the start of the Georgian period with King George I. And the Georgian period in England really lasted until the coronation of Victoria. It's interesting to note that the side hoop skirt was first noted in England at this time. And in fact, the Spectator of 1711 mentioned that the hoop petticoat has made use of to keep us, i.e. men, at a distance. So it's as early as it started in fashion in England. Already there were commentators who were chiding women for adopting these new panniers and as an inconvenience to the men around them. There is a lot of question about where the hoops originated from, moving again away from that vertical tight style of the mantua and the fontange at the end of the 17th century. And some people have extrapolated that it was influenced by costuming, theatrical costuming, and specifically the dresses that actresses would wear on stage that would emphasize their hips in order to make their waists appear smaller. And others say that it may have been an influence from the minor courts in Germany that came over with the Habsburg dynasty, because there was this Spanish influence still in some of these minor courts where the farthingale was still employed. So just getting back to, again, some of these journal entries at the start of the 18th century regarding hoop petticoats. The Weekly Journal of 1717 asked women to find one tolerable convenience in these machines. And the Salisbury Journal noted that swaying hoops revealed ankles and legs and scolded women, stating, "A hoop 8 yards wide may indecently show your garter, how your garters are tied." So it was women were being chided for not making room for men. They were being chided for it being an intolerable convenience, and so they were being frivolous in employing these as part of their fashion, and they were having their morality questioned because with one little tilt they could show their leg and much more. And here you see the construction of the panier. Of course, panier comes from the French term basket. And looking at the construction of this, we can understand why. Panier were constructed using reed or whalebone to keep their shape, and encased in a cotton or linen petticoat there. And they became quite expansive. As you can see, this woman going into her opera box. Women would often have to enter doorways sideways, as you can see here. But it was also a time when people would promenade both in public outdoor spaces and in social spheres. So there was definitely an enticement to be seen. This is the wedding dress of Sophia Magdalena of Denmark from 1766, and it just shows how wide the panier became at court. And to question why there was such a vast display of an expanse of these paniers, you can look at some reasoning can be what was going on in textile production at this time. In the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company had flooded the market with inexpensive printed cottons and silks from India and China. And so as a result, there was a reaction in France and England to really protect the textile industry there, and invest in the workmanship that was created. France was known for its silk weaving. Of course, under Louis XIV, towards the end of his reign, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, and many Protestant Huguenots fled religious persecution in France to England, and with them they brought their silk weaving experience. And this influx of Huguenots into England really helped found the Spitalfields silk weavers in London. So we saw an increase of silk production in London. So the display of these fabrics did have, to some degree, patriotic overtones, but really the expanse of these paniers was about conspicuous consumption and demonstrating a woman's economic status and their place in court. Some technological advancements, really we can say that the Industrial Revolution had its start in this time period. Some technological advancements included in 1733, John Kay inventing the fly shuttle, which literally flies through the warp threads to help rapidly produce fabrics. In 1770, James Hargreaves developed the spinning jenny, which was a machine that allowed more than 100 spindles to wind uniform thread at the same time. 1785, Edmund Cartwright patented the steam-powered loom, making it possible for factories to move away from fast-flowing water sources that would be the power source for looms. And by the mid 1700s, there were print rolling machines that replaced the wood block printing. This was also an era where fashion magazines had their root. And 1778, it's worth noting that the Galerie de Mode, which was one of the earliest fashion magazines, was founded. There were also fashion dolls that would travel across Europe so that other communities could see what the courts of other lands was considered in fashion at the time. And fashion dolls were literally small dolls that were dressed in the fashions of the day. Now, this is another meme that I've seen out there quite a bit. And I think it's sort of funny because there was actually a contemporary fear that women wearing pannier were could be thieving and hiding goods in their panniers. So here we have a modern meme discussing, someone walking away with a 50-inch HD TV, or flat screen TV. But in its day, that was one of the criticisms that was out in the public sphere about women wearing pannier. So other criticisms about pannier in this time period discussed women as announcing themselves as independent from the masculine control of their lives because the pannier were creating private space around the women. In 1745, there was a writer who only went by the pen name AW, so those initials, and he wrote an essay titled "The Enormous Abomination of the Hoop Petticoat," which is what the pannier was called in England. He presented the pannier as frivolous and inconvenient, that they could even cause death. And to quote, "Many hundreds, I doubt not, have got their death by them." Also, according to him, men were uncomfortable in public assemblies because one woman could take up as much space as 2 or 3 men, leaving no room at all for the men to congregate. And the same thing could happen at churches, so not allowing men to pray properly, thus making the hooped petticoat or pannier incompatible with modesty and piety. So where is this criticism coming from? At this time, although there were male rulers taking up at the heads of courts across Europe, women were really coming to power and position with the rise of the bourgeoisie, which was a working class, and so with the increase of trade and industrial production, the middle class rose and became much wealthier. So although they were not considered nobility, they did have a lot of money and influence. They also, this rise of power and status by this working class, merchant class group of people also led to the questioning of the divine right that monarchs had over the land and the nobility. It led to the questioning of religious tradition and feudal authority. We were at the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment, where secular humanitarianism was derived from science and logic. And one of the places where this was really discussed were in the salons. And these were held in private homes and mainly by women of power, financial power and status. And where all of these ideas were then discussed. And here we have another example of a gathering at a salon. One of the most famous women of this era in France was Madame de Pompadour. She was of the bourgeoisie class, and as a bourgeoisie woman, she could not be presented at court, nor was she allowed to participate in noble social activities such as the hunt. However, she had her eye on the king, and it was at one of these hunts that she presented herself on one day in a blue gown in a pink sort of carriage, and the next day in a pink gown in a blue carriage. And of course, she caught the eye of the king. And she was, then there was a masquerade ball, and the king dressed himself up as a yew tree. And she dressed herself up as Diana, the huntress, the goddess of the hunt, very apropos. And their affair officially started. So, but to be presented at court, and to take her place by the king's side, or in rooms very nearby him, she required a title. So the king purchased the Marquisate of Pompadour in June 1745, and gave this estate with the title Madame de Pompadour, coat of arms, etc., to her. Her name was originally Jean Antoinette, making her a marquise. In September, Madame de Pompadour made her formal entry before the king of that year. So that was 1745. She became very influential and high-ranked member of the French court. She was the official chief mistress. This was Louis XV from 1745 to 1751, and remained influential as a court favorite until her death. She also really used fashion to assert her power. You can see that. So these are some of the most, when we think of dresses from this time period, these are some of the most famous dresses that spring to mind. Madame de Pompadour was a major patroness of architecture and decorative arts, especially porcelain. She was a patroness of philosophers of the Enlightenment, including Voltaire. She created her own salon, which was attended by many of the cultural elite, Voltaire, Montesquieu, the Cardinal Bernet, where all of these ideas were discussed, these ideas of the Enlightenment were discussed. So although she did not have a position of power like Queen Elizabeth, or as we will see in the next century, Queen Victoria, here we have a woman from a working class who has now attained a position in court where she can even affect how decisions are made, and political decisions are made, and the philosophy of the time period. Another famous woman of this time period is, of course, Marie Antoinette. And she was not as popular an individual. She was the last queen of France before the French Revolution. And it's interesting to note that she actually despised a lot of the accoutrement of court fashion. She would have preferred not to wear a corset. She enjoyed horseback riding and was often scolded for it. And even tried to get rid of the panier at court, which was met with a very unpopular reaction. Here we have two images of her, both from the same time, same year. It's interesting to note as well that she really sort of liked the idea of this sort of English country pastoral life. So she wanted to bring that more into court fashion. She spent more time at the Petit Trianon, which was a small chateau on the ground of Versailles. Her end, of course, was in 1793 with the French Revolution, when she was guillotined. Moving on to the 18th century, here it's just, this is one of these Punch cartoons. Punch was a satirical magazine from the time period, and I always enjoyed this one because you have two women here who are looking at a portrait of a woman from the Empire, Napoleonic time period, and they're both sort of joking to each other, oh, just to think, that our mothers wore such ridiculous fashions. And of course, the comment being that, these women are laughing at what was considered quite a natural shape when they themselves are presenting such an unnatural shape in their crinoline. In 1837, 18-year-old niece to the reigning king, William the Fourth, took to the throne. Her name was Victoria. And in 1840, she marries her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Together, they had 9 children before Albert's death in 1861 at the age of 42 due to typhoid fever. So their family, they had a prolific family life, 9 children. And it could be argued that it is appropriate for Queen Victoria to be the reigning monarch at the age of the crinoline as a tribute to her position as female monarch and her fertility, producing 9 children. It's worth noting that Albert was a huge supporter of scientific study and technological advancement. This is specifically noted with the Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibition of 1851. During this time period, the Industrial Revolution went full steam ahead, quite literally, with in 1807, the steam engine was employed by paddle boats. So this meant that ships no longer were at the mercy of wind and tide, but could be self-powered to deliver people and product. This was followed by steam locomotion in 1814. 1837, the telegraph was invented using Morse code. So the world is becoming smaller as more and more people are able to move across the continent, across the world, and even within their own countries. But trade, product was all moving with it. There were more advanced weaving techniques, and one example of that is jacquard. Elasticized fabrics were first developed in the 1820s, but these were heat sensitive and weakened with heat. But in 1839, Charles Goodyear discovers the vulcanization process, which greatly improved the strength and resiliency of rubber. So we have elasticized fabrics. Mass production increases. We have people leaving the country to work in city factories. There's a mass migration from the countryside into the cities. There's an increase of middle working classes. Fashion trends now emerged where ladies of the upper middle class focused on a passion for refinement and elegance in their homes as opposed to a life in court as well. The image on the right I've left here because it was Victoria reigned until 1901. She was so devastated at the loss of her husband in 1861 that she entered into a deep state of mourning and wore black for the rest of her life and until her death. So you can just see again her lifespan, this time period. Here we have examples of crinolines. Crinoline, of course, gets its name from the French word combination of crin, meaning horsehair, and lin, meaning linen. Crinolines were used from the early 1840s, and the horsehair crinolines really reduced the number of required petticoats needed to achieve the growing fashion for a bell-shaped skirt. And they offered the wearer slightly more freedom of leg movement from layer upon layer upon layer of petticoat. But the crinolines were hot and they were unhygienic, especially in the summer months. So it was with great fanfare that when in April 1856, the steel hoop cage crinoline was first patented. It was patented in Paris and then a few months later in England by R.C. Millet. The new crinoline was a much more scientific apparatus. For manufacturing technology was sufficiently advanced at this point to mass produce flexible steel hoops that could be either strung on cotton tapes or sewn into a petticoat. They became wildly popular. They were lightweight and liberating for women, freeing them from the multiple layers of petticoats worn prior, including even the horsehair crinoline. A ladies' newspaper of 1863 enthusiastically praised the cage crinoline, stating, So perfect are the wave-like bands that a lady may ascend a steep stair, lean against a table, throw herself into an armchair, pass to her stall at the opera, and occupy a farther seat in the carriage without inconveniencing herself or others, and provoking the rude remarks of observers, thus modifying in an important degree all those particularities tending to destroy the modesty of English women. And lastly, it allows the dress to fall in graceful folds. Technological advancements in industry allowed the cage crinoline to be mass produced. One of the biggest producers was Douglas and Shepherd Hoop Skirt Factory in New York. This factory employed 800 women and produced in excess of 8,000 hoop skirts each day. And in England, the top producer was Thompson's, who employed over 1,000 women in London and produced 3,000 to 4,000 per day. And Thompson's were particularly known for their lightweight and how they didn't creak or break. It was one of their selling points. And all just for shillings. So it was considered quite affordable. The fashion for the crinoline, or crinoline mania, was further serviced by the invention of the sewing machine and advanced textile production that allowed for mass production, weaving, and printing of lighter weight, gauzier fabrics. Skirts became wider and involved meters and meters and meters of fabric. Dresses were covered with flounces and with fringe and ribbons. All of these decorations now mass produced and available for purchase at a lower price point than once was. As a result, the cage crinoline was one of the first fashion fads to be relatively affordable and readily available to women of every social standing, much to the perturbation of the growing middle and upper middle classes. Crinolines crossed class barriers and were worn across the Western world, from royalty to factory workers, and as we can see in this punch cartoon, domestic servants. So we have on the left a photograph, and this is another important shift in technology, in that we have the capture of real people in real time via the photograph and daguerreotype in this time period. We're not just relying on paintings or drawings or etchings of people. So we can really see how things lived and on people. So we have an example of Crinoline's shop. And on the right-hand side of the page, we have a cartoon from Punch magazine, and where the woman of the house is deriding her servant, saying that she looks absolutely ridiculous wearing that object when here she is wearing the exact same object. So it's only ridiculous if her servant is wearing it. These next images, I'm afraid I could only find them in small, so they're a bit pixelated, but here are other Punch cartoons where, again, there is satire, criticism of women from the domestic servant classes, how they upset the household by wearing these crinolines under their uniforms or their work clothes, with the woman on the domestic servant on the left upsetting tables and breaking items around her, and the woman on the right having to hike her skirts up so high in order to do her job, that both are indecent and immoral. Legs were still supposed to be invisible in this time period, but the sway and volume, not mass, but volume of the skirts put the exposure of women's legs at risk. And you can see that in this satirical cartoon as well. Therefore, it became customary to wear long pantaloons edged in lace that reached the ankle in order to maintain one's propriety when the skirts would naturally sway and expose a bit of leg. Ankle boots also replaced slippers as appropriate footwear, with some lacing, with some of these boots lacing up midway up the calf during this time period, again, to just help cover the leg. So with the availability of crinolines accessible to all women of all social status, of course, women of higher social status of more wealth wanted to have even greater expanse of crinoline. So the wider skirts were sought after by women of wealth and fashion. And at the largest, the crinoline could reach a circumference of up to 6 yards or 18 feet. Although it must be said that most of these crinolines were only used and reserved for balls, weddings, and other special occasions. So they weren't really day wear, but they could get that large. And there's a series of photographs here showing a woman getting dressed in one of these apparatus. And it's quite likely that these photos were also taken to be a bit titillating, as we see a woman sort of in her undress. But it's interesting to us with a modern eye to see sort of the layers that were involved. You can see how her servants have to lower her dress over top of her head using sticks and poles and standing on stools. It's very clear that as a woman of status, she cannot get dressed on her own. And here again, the final image where one could assume a suitor is trying to reach her, maybe to give her a kiss or canoodle in some way or another, but she remains untouchable. So it's again this interesting look at the crinoline as at once impractical but flirtatious. It's humorous, but also seriousness in a woman being able to preserve her space and remain unattainable if she wants to be. So modern feminism, and I consider myself a feminist, has typically demonized the crinoline as a symbol of Victorian domestic enslavement and submissiveness. This is a widely accepted belief, especially in the 20th century, and can be witnessed in the works of writers such as Virginia Woolf in her Orlando, where the main character Orlando, upon discovering herself in the Victorian era, immediately reacts to her crinoline as the symbol of the repressive Victorian age. The topic of the dangers of crinolines was very popular in the mid-19th century. You could be impaled or disemboweled by the steel hoops springing apart. You could catch a disease from the drafts that you were allowing so close to your body because you no longer had the protection of layers and layers of warm petticoats to keep you safe. You could catch fire or get drawn into industrial machinery or get caught up in the wheels and pinnings of a carriage, as you can see on the top right hand side there. They even became quite ridiculous that in a gust of wind you could get carried away the way that a parachute would take someone away. But to some extent, some of these dangers were valid, particularly with women dying from fires. Because there were not the petticoats to help muffle a fire, women could because some of the fabrics were so light and the paints and dyes were not necessarily fireproofed, women could catch fire quite easily. And there are many examples of, including Oscar Wilde's two half-sisters who both died on the same evening, one trying to put the other one out, who caught fire at a ball. To even an event down in Chile at this time period where there was a fire in a church and all the women wearing their finery to church. There was upwards of 1,000 women who died in that fire. So there was some truth to it, but again, one has to question just why there was so much vitriol in criticizing the crinoline of this time period. So as we saw in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, with size and volume comes power, taking up space. There's a power to that. Again, many historians have discovered and discussed a direct link to the volume of skirts with women being in positions of power. So we had Elizabeth, we have the salons of the 18th century, and now we have Victoria. Looking at cartoons and satirical magazines like Punch, it was clear that the commentary was not just about how vain and excessive the fashion was, but also how much space women were taking up, and how much men, in particular, hated women taking up too much space. So the importance of so this is where I think it's really great to look at documents like satirical magazines such as Punch, because you get a real biting commentary on how people are viewing the world around them, rather than just looking at pretty clothes and what um, uh, people wished to be in fashion magazines, etc. But really, these satirical Punch cartoons are a great commentary on the criticisms, and it gets us thinking of questioning why they're being critiqued the way that they are. So here is another great Punch cartoon about that sort of looks at how much men hate women taking up space, especially when it prevented them from getting what they wanted. And of course, this cartoon in particular points out sort of the eroticism of women wearing evening clothes, evening attire in this time period. During the day, women were often quite buttoned up to the neck, but in the evening, it was not uncommon for even women to replace the bodices that they were wearing with something that would come off the shoulder and have quite a low décolletage. So it was a sense of sort of flirtation. It was erotic, but men had to keep their distance. They couldn't touch. And I think some of these reactions as well are of men hurting they're getting slammed to the wall. There's not enough space for them. They're hurting their shins on the steel hoops. But with the women's breasts being hanging out in the open like that, there's also certainly a pain in them not being able to get their hands on what they want. It's worth noting that towards the end of the century, crinoline was also used as a naval term for defense. So, and it was a net that went specifically at the front of a ship that acted as a barrier against torpedo attack. So these nets, called crinolines, helped prevent a torpedo from penetrating the hull of a ship. So it's fun, I think, to sort of think about the crinoline as a form of defense against attack from torpedoes and other such pointy objects. But the other thing that crinolines really helped with women in terms of sort of a freedom was that women had more leg movement in a crinoline as opposed to a petticoat. And here's a sort of a compilation of a bunch of women wearing the crinoline. There's a great sort of website that you can, and I know that you can follow her on Facebook as well, but a woman who sort of runs a site called Prior Attire, and she's done a great series of short videos where she dresses up in clothing from different time periods. And she has a great one where she's in a cage crinoline, and it just shows you how easy they are to actually move in. And again, going back to the criticism of them being, of crinolines being dangerous for women around fire, it is possible that because they were so easy to move in, women maybe were less careful about just how easily they moved, and thus they became a little less careful around open flame. But it's worth looking up. So Prior Attire, and you can just see how easily they were able to go up and down stairs and even sit in the crinolines. It's also interesting with the hips being as wide as they are with the cage crinoline, that I remember reading as a student, I remember reading that this was a time when women could also loosen their corsets because their waists looked slimmer in contrast to the size of their hips. So although we hear the Scarlett O'Hara and the emphasis on the 18-inch waist, it was an opportunity during this time period to not tight lace. So one could look at this as a way of subverting suppression as well, with women employing these large hoops to balance the size of their waist with the size of their hips. So the bigger the skirt, the smaller their waist looked. When you watch someone walking in a crinoline, and particularly a cage crinoline, their stride changes. And I would argue that the stride becomes more confident. Women are able to take bigger steps. The skirt swayed, it had an energy and a movement to it. And the crinolines were lightweight enough that they could be moved quite easily, as I mentioned before. So there's a lecture that that I caught a couple of years ago, and it's called "The Crinoline Cage: Fashionable Dress and Visual Culture in the Mid 19th Century." And it was a lecture given by a woman named Linda Need. And it was really fascinating because I was often, it was the first time that I had a fashion historian confirm some of these thoughts that I'd had about whether or not the cage crinoline really was as oppressive as we tend to think of it. And in this lecture, Linda Need asks, was the crinoline a sign of female subjugation or a sign of physical presence and feminine power? Was the crinoline a sign of slavery or an embodiment of pleasure? And I think the answer is somewhere in between. I think that women were allowed to take pleasure. Women of all social status were allowed to take pleasure, sartorial pleasure, in dressing themselves in a cage crinoline. And there were certain drawbacks to it. There certainly were problems when it came to trying to fit on public transit. Linda Need herself tells this great story of there being a crowd of people welcoming the new princess who was going to marry one of Queen Victoria's children, and the crowd became so overwhelming that the women just dropped their crinolines on the ground so that they could escape the crowds better. But, oops, sorry. So her lecture also describes a series of contradictions with the crinoline. So here we have a steel banded structure that is used to support the impression of soft folds of fabric, sort of billowing from it. We have a fashion of volume, but the absence of mass. We have a fashion for spatial expanse, which is constructed on something that's insubstantial. So it's got me thinking about other ways that we can look at the crinoline to visually represent paradoxes in future incidents. So when there's a paradox being discussed in a storyline of a production, for example, how can we employ those types of ideas? It's worth noting that the women's movement, and when we think of Amelia Bloomer, or when we think of the women's movement in this time period, we really think of Amelia Bloomer, had its start in America during this time period as well. In 1848, there was the Declaration of Sentiments at the Conference of Women, demanding equal citizenship, political rights, opportunities for education and employment, and dress reform. But it didn't really get very far in England, and it wasn't until the end of the century and women getting on bicycles more as a way of freedom and transport that dress reform really took hold. We saw it a bit in the aesthetic dress movement, which was really an artistic movement in England. But I think it just shows a little difference in the way women in the States and women in England, where maybe we're looking at power. Here we have a couple of examples of men employing the crinoline, the idea of the crinoline, uh, as a way of protective dress, and where physical distancing can actually be a good thing. And this is called the anti-garroting device, where a man has been influenced by his wife's crinoline, and it keeps him from being strangled and robbed as he walks in the evenings at London. So we have crinoline again being used as a defense. And here again, another cartoon from Punch where a man is employing a crinoline to have his space while skating on a pond. So now he can say that he has elegance and safety combined, and he calls it the skater's friend. This is another social distancing meme, social distancing now and then. It's ironic, of course, that the voluminous skirts of the 19th century were ultimately abandoned for hygiene reasons. With the acceptance and greater understanding of germ theory in the late 19th century, it was realized that the long hems of women's garments harbored not only street dirt, but germs. The hygienic dress movement of the 1880s fought against fashion that could harbor disease. So with the acceptance of germ theory, we really didn't see the hoop skirts or the vast expanse of fabric being used quite in the same way. So it's interesting that, although we're using the hoop skirt as a meme for social distance fashion, physical distance fashion today, in fact, it was the reason why it was no longer being used. And these are just some examples, early examples of people using a hoop apparatus to demonstrate physical distance and how to keep your 6 feet away. This woman using pool noodles in a store. And here we have other examples of this woman on the left has these skirts that are sort of fashion physical distancing skirts that are made with lace to help keep your distance. Again, a woman in the center here where she's using both the bubonic plague doctor's mask as well as a hoop skirt. We have up in the right-hand side was an instance of a gentleman in Spain who created a disc out of cardboard so that people would keep their space from him while grocery shopping. And of course, in the bottom right-hand side, this is just very recently where people have been using these bumper cars in order to keep their physical distance while drinking at a restaurant. We're going to move on to punks now. So this was a meme I found, punk meme that I've come across. So what if COVID-19 was a person? The British punk movement was born out of angry youth protest. In the 1970s in the UK, there was a time of open conflict. The economy was in absolute disarray. There were strikes. Strike leaders were being sent to prison, then freed by a massive strike wave. Teenagers were fighting in the streets. There was the rise of the Troubles in Ireland. There were miners' strikes, power cuts. There was the women's rights movement and marches for that. The Tory government was brought down. And for a while there, with the Tory government being brought down, the working class really thought that they had sort of won a toehold in getting their voices heard. But it all turned sour. Britain was near bankruptcy. They had to get loans from the International Monetary Fund, who imposed restrictions that were so tight that it saw some of the greatest cuts to social services in England in decades, since certainly before World War II. So a lot of people felt betrayed by Labour leadership. There was a sharp rise in unemployment, especially among youth. So under the leadership of Prime Minister Harold Wilson, unemployment skyrocketed from 700,000 in 1975 to 1.4 million in 1977. And again, youth were the hardest hit. So for the first time since ever since the baby boomer generation, the youth generation would be worse off than their parents. Racism was on the rise. There was a fascist national front that started parading in the streets, and it started doing well in local elections. The great expectations of the 1960s had faltered and failed, and punks were declaring there's no future in England's dreaming. Here you can see on some of the jackets. Punks lived, therefore, very much in the present. So by sort of espousing this nihilistic no future attitude, they were really expressing that life was without purpose. The punk movement was absolutely anti-nostalgic. So unlike other sort of youth fashions and protest fashions, like for example, the Teddy Boys that referenced Edwardian fashion, punk was one of the first youth movements that was absolutely anti-nostalgic. It existed in its time period. Although punk still exists today, its modern form is no longer anti-nostalgic. The original phenomenon itself was remarkably short, only lasting a few years until the early 1980s. Punks rebelled against the back-to-earth hippie movement and the rigidity and fabrication of disco. So you think that disco was a reaction to the hippie movement because disco, I mean, the steps were, you went to classes to learn the steps to a disco dance. And this was a reaction to both of those. Disco was also very consumerist and sparkly and shiny. The punk movement was anti-consumerism. It was very much DIY, and where people really took time and put a lot of effort into personalizing their jackets, for example. The punk movement was androgynous, it was nihilist, and also described as sartorial havoc. It was also a very violent fashion movement where clothing was slashed and pieced together with safety pins. And those same safety pins were also used to pierce ears and noses, and as you can see, mouths, all linking together with chains. The punk movement used shock value to provoke, and it provoked a media-driven moral panic as well. So, as mentioned before, the mass youth unemployment and alienation by the middle and upper classes fed the punk movement. In these current social norms, the poor British youth were not valued and felt helpless in their fight to change their reality. Therefore, for punks, the only way they saw to initiate change in society was to transform themselves into directly offensive and threatening beings. Here we have the spike hairstyle called Liberty Spikes, and they're called Liberty Spikes because they reference the Statue of Liberty. Interestingly, Liberty Spikes can trace their origins to the ancient Britons, whose warriors who washed their hair in lime water and also bleached it blonde, but in order to gain these spikes. But it was a hairstyle that was highly symbolic as a badge of honor, because Celts were not allowed to spike or cut their hair until they had killed an enemy. But the spiked hair was also the absolute complete opposite of the long, sleek hair or natural hair of the hippie and disco movements. The anti-establishment stance of punk opened up space for women who had been treated like outsiders in male-dominated music industry before. But here, women were finally sort of being accepted in this place of anarchy. Women were finding that they had a voice in the movement. And some of the greatest, I mean, one can very easily do a history of punk music, or the origins of punk music, and name soul female bands. So some of those are Susie and the Banshees, Chrissy Hyde and the Pretenders, the Slits. In America, we had Debbie Harry, Joan Jett and the Runaways, Patti Smith. And some of contemporaries, oops, sorry, the slides are going. Some of their contemporaries talked about women's place in the punk movement. Johnny Rotten said that during the Pistols era, women were out there playing with men, taking us on in equal terms. It wasn't combative, but compatible. Chrissy Hind said that was the beauty of the punk thing. Sexual discrimination didn't exist in that scene. And Sonic Youth's Kim Gordon talked about it as, I think women are natural anarchists because you're always operating in a male framework. So it was a place where women actually had a strong voice in what, I think even looking back, one would think is by pure nature of its sort of violence and aggressiveness, one might think it's more of a male movement. But here we have contemporary discussion of it being a very equitable movement. In the summer of 1976, London art students and the unemployed youth started hanging out on King's Road in Chelsea and gathering around a shop that was called Sex. And it was run by Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, who were partners at that time, both in life and in business. McLaren was a self-proclaimed social rebel. He identified with this Situationist International, which was an international organization of social revolutionaries made up of avant-garde artists, intellectuals, all of whom had a penchant for anti-authoritarian Marxism. But the group also believed and promoted in the absurdist and provocative actions as a way of enacting social change. So they really tapped into sort of the zeitgeist and what they were seeing around them. Their store Sex sold fetish clothing, harnesses, rubber, PVC, bondage pants, obscene jewelry, deliberately ripped t-shirts that had provocative messages put on them. They tapped into that psyche, that youth psyche, and punk fashion was created. McLaren was responsible for creating the Sex Pistols. Vivienne Westwood clothed them, and the band quickly gained notoriety in the media for their antics, their offensive lyrics, and their outrageous clothes. Punk quickly spread throughout Europe and North America. It showed how fashion could challenge stereotypes of gender and beauty. But by 1979, the Sex Pistols had broken up. Sid Vicious was dead of a heroin overdose. Westwood had moved on to designing her new romantic collection and clothing the new wave. And as I said, we still see punk today. This is a modern band, but it's no longer sort of that anti-nostalgic movement that it started off being. And we can see how punk has influenced fashion, even today. So with the Versace safety pin dress, to Chanel, to even just a few years ago, Alexander McQueen with the lip jewelry. Now, when we talk about sort of spiky fashion, then we also have our pool noodles. And here are a couple of other images that are quickly making their rounds. And I actually quite feel for this fellow on the left-hand side. I know a lot of people I saw a lot of sort of jokes about him online, but you can see he's actually wearing oxygen. So this is a real serious thing for him, but he's using the pool noodles to, again, maintain his distance and telling people to stay away, maybe in the same way that, similar way that punks used spikes and their Liberty spike hairstyles. And we can see someone riding the subway as well, employing pool noodles as a way of protecting them. And that, I think, was sort of influenced by people using pool noodles to remind cars to keep their distance in the bike movement, the urban bike movement. This is another recent incidence of pool noodles being used to remind people to keep their distance at a restaurant in Germany, where they've created pool noodle hats. Burger King, who I have noticed with much amusement over the years, is always quick to sort of jump on the sort of interesting way of promoting their product, have created these enormous Burger King crowns to promote social distance while enjoying their product. And again, somewhat poignantly, you have children in China returning to school and using balloons and pool noodles to remind them to keep their distance. These are slightly different in that they are inspired by the headdresses worn by the emperors of the Song dynasty, and they're all personalized, but you can clearly see how they've been used to remind students to keep their distance. We're going to move to masks. I know we're starting to run out of time, but masks, I think, are one of the ways that we most prominently right now are seeing how COVID-19 is affecting fashion. So a quick overview of masks. There's a lot of controversy around the sort of the plague doctor outfit that's seen here. A lot of people think of it as a medieval garment, when in fact it's a garment that really wasn't used before the 17th century. It's been attributed to a doctor named Charles Lorme, who invented it in 1630, and then it spread throughout Europe and was used to help combat the bubonic plague. It was a protective suit that consisted of a light scented waxed fabric overcoat and breeches that were connected to boots, a shirt that was tucked in, gloves that were made of goat leather. It had a mask with glass eye openings and a beak-shaped nose, which was typically stuffed with herbs and straw and spices, all of which were thought to filter out any bad air and thus protect the doctor. And they often also carried this cane, which they could use to sort of poke at their patients or direct them without having to talk, because it was quite difficult to do so. Really, I haven't found any sort of evidence as to why it was bird-like, beak-like, with the exception that it was put in a beak because it was thought that that allowed enough space for the herbs and straw and everything to filter the air before entering the human body. So it was protecting the doctor from miasma or bad air, and it was thought that the bad air was behind the bubonic plague, when in fact it was, again, being spread by fleas. It was a disease that was being spread by flea bites, but that miasma or bad air upset the body's humors, which were the body fluids, thus creating death. And here we can see, again, another example of a drawing of a plague doctor, but also modern examples. The one in the center was a sighting in Norwich. There was a fellow going out in his plague doctor outfit and creating a lot of upset in the community, as people called him frightening. And this is quite recently, only a couple of months ago. But we can even see on the right-hand side another example of how the plague doctor look is making a comeback. Of course, we have experienced pandemics in what we would consider the modern age, where masks have been employed. And one of the clearest first examples of that after the acceptance of germ theory is the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which is considered one of the deadliest pandemics in history. It affected an estimated 500 million people worldwide, which was about 1/3 of the world's population, and killed an estimated 20 to 50 million people. This flu was most deadly for people aged 20 to 40, and it was devastating after the trauma of World War I. But also, I mean, I think clearly demonstrated how this pandemic spread because of the amount of travel that was happening at that time, with people coming back from Europe after the war. And we can see people here with a sign on saying wear a mask or go to jail. And we have some Canadian farmers there on the left-hand side. But again, some of the information that was out there at this time: coughs and sneezes spread diseases, so dangerous as poison gas shells. Again, really talking to World War I introduced a form of warfare that had not been seen before in the public. And one of the tools of that was the use of poison gas, and it was absolutely horrific. So you can only imagine how poignant that advert would have been at that time. We can see here how fashion and the use of masks was employed, with this woman's mask on the right-hand side actually stretching over her hat there. And again, even women and children, everyone wearing the mask. Masks have been used as well to help protect against our environment. And here we have examples of a vizard, where women in particular would wear this black velvet mask that was held in place by biting on, by holding it in their teeth, biting on a button to hold it in place. And it would help keep women's skin pale, protect it from the sun. And with all the concern over the environment, we have a real pollution chic with smog, and trying to protect ourselves from smog, where we've recently seen masks used in fashion. And it's quite common, in fact, in Asian countries for people to be seen wearing masks as a way of protecting against pollution and disease. Masks are also being used in our community as a form of artistic expression. So here we have two music artists, Ao and Teo, who started wearing masks because they were being criticized for their facial expressions that they would make when rapping. So now it's become a signature accessory and part of their creative identity. And another example of that is, of course, Pussy Riot. And here you're sort of straddling the idea of mask as protest, mask as punk, but also it's very much their creative identity of their band. They were imprisoned in Russia. For those that don't know Pussy Riot, they're a Russian punk band, all female, that goes against the government, and they were imprisoned in 2012 for hooliganism. So mask as a form of protest, we see that as protecting, whether it be so that you can keep their identities hidden, or protecting from tear gas, things of that nature. We saw masks a lot used in the recent protests in Hong Kong, to the point that masks were being banned in Hong Kong, of course, just before the COVID crisis really hit. Another place where we've often seen mask is used as protest is, of course, the Guy Fawkes mask, otherwise known as the anonymous mask. And this was really inspired by the graphic novel V for Vendetta. But we see it as a sort of a anti-government protest, the use of the Guy Fawkes mask. Guy Fawkes, of course, made famous for the gunpowder plot of 1605, his participation in that, being caught and then executed as a result. To help quell protest, perhaps, I mean, there's a lot of talk about facial recognition and how to protest against facial recognition technology. And so there's been a new sort of upswing in masks that are being used to thwart facial technology. So everything from as homemade as, again, using a basic N95 mask and covering with your sunglasses, to fracturing your facial features, either using a mask or even makeup. With now that we are in the age of COVID-19, one thing that people are beginning to notice is actually how much we rely on facial recognition for things like our cell phones, and how wearing a mask in public is now becoming problematic, with just sort of looking at your phone and having it become disabled, so that you can access it without having to type in your code. So now there's a new sort of movement where it's the facial recognition mask. where you can put the bottom of your face on a mask that will protect you from pathogens, but still have the technology at your fingertips, able to read who you are. This is a recent Vogue cover from Portugal, Freedom on Hold. And with masks, there's been a whole push because there's been a shortage of PPE for medical facilities right across the world. There's been a real push to have people wear non-medical masks. And so what I'm finding really interesting in looking at these non-medical masks is just, again, how homemade they look, using fabrics that are quilt cottons, but it's almost as though you're going out of the way to make a statement that this is a non-medical masks. That said, I mean, masks, it's interesting right now. Masks are such a symbol of our current COVID confusion and anxiety. There's a lot of protest against wearing masks, and I find it's sort of interesting in the same way that you heard people protesting against people taking up, against particularly women taking up space. You have people sort of saying that it's my right to not have to, you're infringing on my rights by forcing me to wear a mask or suggesting that I wear a mask. So there's an interesting correlation there for me right now. That's a picture of me wearing my non-medical mask. There's also been a real sort of resurgence of do-it-yourself and getting crafty with your masks. I find it a little bit interesting with this sort of the needlework masks that, of course, the more holes you poke in a mask, then the more chance there is of pathogens coming in, but one would assume that it's been lined with something. Advancements in technology about how to deal with children, again, non-medical, we're all trying to find ways to sort of have non-medical masks, but this image really struck me when I saw it with these I believe it was Taiwan, these babies wearing the shields. Of course, very quickly, companies jumped on the opportunity to brand masks. And I think it was within days that particularly sports teams were creating masks that were branded with their sports teams. And you see other industries getting in on the act, including ordering your own for your own business. And the fashion industry is very much getting involved with branding current masks for our COVID world. The Dior mask is actually one that a person I know ordered and arrived. And here we see how fashion is having fun with the mask. As Jean-Paul Gaultier on the left-hand side there with his COVID look. There have been artists that have been taking Adidas shoes and reconstructing them to create masks. So again, taking sort of conspicuous fashion element and creating something new for a COVID world. And then to this sort of strangely, ridiculously sublime, oversized bag that's been created in the shape of a face mask. And even companies like Old Navy are getting in on the game and selling masks for the whole family in a variety of styles and colors. We're also seeing masks, people from multicultural backgrounds really embracing the creation of masks as a reflection of their culture. And we can see that there's been a lot of really beautiful examples of how the Indigenous peoples of Canada, some of the artists are looking at masks and how they can use their artistic skills to create masks. And here you have examples of Canadian artists. Dolores Gull, who's created, again, one of the bubonic plague doctor masks in her Indigenous tradition. And here on the West Coast, an artist, carver, creating masks. So when we think about future and where we're going, this is where we're hoping, if we still have time, that we can sort of open the conversation. I've done a lot of talking and I haven't seen myself at all. So it feels I've just sort of been talking to myself a little bit here. This is a very strange thing for me. But again, just some examples of clearly where I think, where some examples of where fashion is going to go with these masks. I mean, even having store mannequins with masks on, the t-shirt on the bottom right, saying, don't stand so close to me, and branded t-shirts with, we've sort of everything from funny statements like I've been social distancing for years to we can do this together, to coordinated mask outfits, where they become very much a part of a coordinated a look. The trikini in the center there. What's interesting is these garments in the red, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the designer's name right now, but not only is it masked, but also you look at the gloves, they look like they could be easily sort of washed as well. So they've also incorporated sort of a glove protection as a fashion statement. And there we have. Thank you for practicing your social distancing. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and open this up for anyone who's still here. There we are. Hi, Erica.
Thanks so much. That was really great. Oh, wait, we have some people are joining us in the waiting room, I guess, coming back. Does anyone want to write in the chat and make some comments, or if you have any questions, feel
I have a
free
question.
to turn on your mic. Oh, Mary says, great lecture. Thank you, Mary.
Oh, and I'm just seeing your notes now. I'm sorry, I didn't see that before, Erica.
Don't worry, that's all good. I think it made it really accessible.
Okay.
So, oh, great. Graham, really enjoyed this. Sierra really enjoys this. Thanks so much. I learned a lot. This is super.
Okay.
Now's the moment, everyone. I know that we've gone over a little bit by about 15 minutes, and we could have had more time. We started a bit late, getting it on the Zoom, but oh, amazing. Marisol, thank you. Tamara is always so interesting and pertinent. And wonderful lecture. C'est que des fleurs, as we would say. Okay, yeah. Well, Willow, if you can ask via the chat, or if you want, do you want to unmute yourself and you can ask your question?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Willow.
Hi, thank you so much, Tamara. That was wonderful. I have a quick question about the end of the crinoline in the late 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
You spoke about how the crinoline eventually went out of fashion in large part because of issues of hygiene. And I was wondering if there's also anything to be said about the uprising of the suffrage movement and the end of the crinoline.
I mean, certainly, I think that I mean, all of those movements sort of converged at the end. So the crinoline, by the end of the 1860s, it was moving into a different shape. We were entering into a bustle period, but there was still a lot of action going on and fabrics dragging on the ground. But as more and more women entered the workplace, there was a need for an independent way to get around. So I always sort of say that the bicycle actually, and as the bicycle became more affordable for your average person to purchase as a way of getting around, and didn't have to rely on horses or public transport, or the car was just on the horizon. It was really the bicycle, I think, that cemented the suffrage movement and the feminist movement. There was certainly signs of it, as I mentioned. Amelia Bloomer and her lot were really were trying to instill a dress reform. But there was still a lot of resistance. And that's where, again, I sort of go back and question, how much pleasure were women taking in taking up space at that time? And maybe women weren't ready yet to sort of give that up. And so that's where I sort of, for me, I kind of go, well, the pleasure aspect of taking up space. But I think that the adoption of germ theory towards the end of the century, I think certainly helped move that along. But ultimately, I think it was just the need to get out, make a living, and in an economical way that fully sealed the deal.
Thank you.
Super. So it looks like, Allison, have you got a question? Your camera is on. Oh, maybe an audio. Okay, we're gonna wait a second. Marco Lacoste has written, don't you think that women were protected but also encaged in the crinoline?
Yeah, I think, that's where I say there's a real dichotomy there, and I think that the crinoline certainly impeded movement. There are absolute risks to wearing it. I think that's undeniable. I think the level of vitriol in some of the comments that are made in the Punch cartoons, I think suggest that other people were more annoyed by them than necessarily the women that were wearing them. But I do think that, and absolutely the women wearing a small waist and big skirt clearly showed that it was a sign of affluence in that they were not able to move easily about in a house. Therefore, it was very clear that they were not of the working class, the domestic working class. So there was a certain conspicuous consumption element, arm candy, if you will, to it as well. So there's a definite dichotomy there. Yeah.
Thank you, Marco, for that question. Does anyone else have any? I think Allison.
And again, a lot of these are my thoughts, right? So as I said, this is just sort of, as a designer, you take in a lot of information from a lot of aspects of research and from a lot of historians, and you balance them sort of with your own thoughts and ideas. Allison, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. So besides being a theater student, I'm also a history student focusing on the AIDS crisis. So it was interesting, especially with the punk conversation. It kind of got me thinking what in terms of pandemics, especially at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, when we really didn't know how it was spread. We had kind of only, especially in America, only had it was a gay thing. So what fashion, it was kind of less what what fashion was physically bearing and what fashion was kept us away for, social reasons, like say like a leather movement, something like that around in the early 80s, making people kind of, you would avoid them in terms of like hoping to avoid AIDS, kind of like that. That was just what your lecture got me thinking about in terms of my own research.
Right. Yeah.
I didn't know. Yeah, I just thought, because what makes us stand back now? Because I think especially in COVID, with people, Chinese people and Asian people becoming so targeted for hate crimes and people avoiding them altogether, what like fashion in early AIDS crisis and gay fashion would make people stand away. Yeah, that's what, and how all around AIDS crisis affected fashion. It's incredible.
I'd have to put, I don't know that I have anything to add to that. I mean, that's something that I'd really have to think about, but I don't know if anyone else wants to, sorry, you're muted.
Oh, no, sorry.
But
yeah, no, it was more of a general statement that what your class got me thinking about.
Yeah. It would be worth looking into that. That's actually really good. I think I'm going to do some looking into that myself with this time on my hands that I have, you know, so that's that would be great. That's a good question. It's a good question. Now, what do people think about where we're going to go with this? I mean, right now we have masks that are sort of the most I think topical right now. And again, there's that push pull about wearing masks or not wearing masks. You know, another obvious is here we are being seen from the waist up. And I know everyone's talked about, you know, people no longer wear pants to work because, you know, but I do think that this is going to really affect how we look at business attire. Questions that I have is like, what are the new rebels? What's going to be the new youth movement? You know, are we going to have, is the new rebel going to be someone that goes out dressed to the nines, and we have a return to, you know, sort of hats and gloves and purses, and that's going to be sort of the rebellion against sort of this more casual workplace where everyone goes to the office. When we do return to the office, is it going to be a yoga pant, you know, chic? You know, are we going to be seeing like outerwear that, you know, no longer has buckles, you know, that doesn't have that type of decoration, so that it's easily wipe downable, so you can clean yourself? Are we going to be looking at higher necked shirts so that we can sort of duck our faces into turtlenecks or you know, high collars, so that, you know, we feel like our breathing, our mouth is protected, or that we are protecting others? Gloves, you know, all of these things are sort of a question for me as we move forward. Certainly thinking from a theatrical point of view, I mean, I've been really thinking about, while I could see dance include costuming that involves masks of some sort, I really, the actor's face and the ability to read lips as a way of entering into the world of storytelling, I'm really not certain how we could how that might play moving forward at all. But if anyone has any thoughts on that, I welcome them. But
I have just one thing to say. I feel like in terms of fashion wise, I feel like a lot of kids my own age don't seem to care about what's going on, or like that there's even a pandemic going on, especially back home. I'm from Georgia originally, and back home, like, it's everywhere's opened up. No one seems to really care. So if, like, depending on which regions and how like this has actually affected people and how caring people are about this situation, I think will also affect the like which regions, you know, change fashion more.
it's interesting. I mean, I question this. Like, I found it quite shocking. There was all this, you could see on the news, Trinity Bellwoods Park in Toronto, and just how packed it was. And I found it just shocking that people don't seem to be taking this seriously. So, I mean, I don't know, is it going to be, you know, we have nail polish now that you can dip your finger in a drink to see if your drink has been roofied. Like, are we going to have clothing that somehow indicates the you know, sort of spray of some sort, you know, or not even necessarily like that it reads that you have the virus, but just, you know, just so people become aware of where their breath is going, that their breath can have repercussions on the people around them. You know, how are we going to get people to take this seriously, and will fashion have a part in that? Does, you know, is that even the role of fashion?
And perhaps on a maybe more disturbing level, depending on how you look at it, I've heard a lot of talk of people wearing some kind of outward indicator that they have already had the virus and are now immune.
Right.
And there's been a lot of talk of that becoming a legitimate possibility, which it's one of those paradoxes that could both be a way for all of us to protect ourselves in this social contract, but also a way to create a new form of class between those who are safe and those who aren't.
Absolutely. You know, and it's interesting that you bring that up, because I remember when this whole first started, there was a lot of fear in the community, both of people demanding that they know who in the community had it, and those saying, whoa, 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 you know, this is a private issue and you do not have the right to. And I just, you know, and I had these visions of the, you know, the big red X on people's doors, and you know, as to who's you know, who's got it and who doesn't. So that's a really interesting point, because I have heard in other countries that people have been given like special apps on their phone if they've had the virus, so that they're sort of on their phone, they can sort of declare themselves as safe and therefore able to go out into the greater community more. But no, it's a good point. Really good point. Anyway, anyone else have any thoughts?
I'm going to speak up for Graham here, who
Sorry.
comment about is Comedia resonating for anyone else regarding theater text, mask, and actor.
Yeah, I thought about that actually, Graham. Comedia and also ancient Greek, where, you know, hi, how are you, by the way? So nice to see you. It's yeah, but like, you know, maybe that's how you do it, like with the big mouths that once amplified the actors of ancient Greece. You know, are those going to be filtered somehow? Are we going to have microphones in there?
Right.
know?
Well, technology, it seems like it's the time.
Yeah.
It's like it's the time to re-examine the possibility of that. You had mentioned about dance. My great concern, of course, is the human proximity.
Right. Yeah.
Our understandings, you know, the general idea about dance is that there's this excitement when people become inappropriately close, in truth. And mask and glove, sweat.
Yeah.
At any rate, yeah, no, I really enjoyed this, Tamara. Thank you so much for it.
Good. Thank you, Graham.
Lovely.
This is such a weird thing, I have to say. Like, this is like, talk about Brave New World. This is the first time I have ever felt like I talked to myself for over an hour.
Is it?
So,
I talk to myself, right?
Well, you know what I mean, like, but just
Thank you.
sort of, yeah. Anyway, I do miss.
I'm just wondering.
Yes,
Tara, I was just wondering, did you do this with PowerPoint?
I did, and I guess you all saw my
Speaking
notes and
of someone
everything.
looking to do it all.
Yeah.
I'm trying
No,
to
I did
figure
it on PowerPoint, and actually we did a test before where you couldn't see my notes, but I understand that you could all see my notes. So I
I
don't
can
sound,
see your note. Yeah.
so
yeah.
I don't sound as off the cuff and as intelligent as I wanted to, but oh well.
You know, I think it's really interesting what you say, because I don't think of theater as purely text-based. So it might not matter that we do not see the face. I mean, if we start to think of it more sonically, of what's happening with sound, or Graham with dance, what would happen if someone went push, but they were 6 feet away and the person reacted 6 feet away? You know, this could become, maybe we'll develop some new potential actions that are not about close up, you know? So both those comments made me think about other things, because I think this thing is going to be with us for quite some time. And I think if fashion is basically a reaction to history and culture, you're absolutely right about technology and other aspects becoming part of signation and synergy. So I think that's going to be, I think we're in a very strange, brave new world, and we don't yet know where it's going, which is always great for artists, but not for necessarily a society. So
Yeah, but looking at you're absolutely right. Like, until, you know, and maybe I'm a Pollyanna. And for those of you that don't understand the reference, Pollyanna was a little girl who always found the sunshine in something. But you know, I do have this faith that we will get back. We will get back to storytelling in the theater the way we have. But until we do, it's important, I think, to explore other ways of storytelling, and like really sort of, as you said, Mary, explore ways of story, more physically telling stories as opposed to verbally telling stories. You know, when there was that mime troupe in the 70s, and I don't even know if they may still be out there, but remember they all wore like black body leotards, and they had plasticine that they would change the expressions on their face.
Mom chants, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was even one where I think they had toilet paper attached, and they would but yeah, incredible storytelling through
Or even that article in the Times, New York Times yesterday by Billy T. Jane, talking about Billy T. Jones and his whole thing about what does this show for a dancer? What is this ahead of him? I'm fascinated with the fact that people are now stopped saying, gee, here we are, we're all going to survive. But there's talking now philosophically about where we actually are, not we're going to return to normal, because normal isn't necessarily a good place. It wasn't working very well. And even normal theater was not working very well. It was dying. So I think it's all got to be thought of, well, what happened? We started around the fire with everyone singing and dancing. Where does this go? And then they were afraid of the wild animals outside the fire. I don't know. It's made me think very deeply, and is thinking, I have no answers, just thinking in a different way, which is really neat that you brought this up.
I think we might have actually lost Tamara right now.
Tamara.
I don't see her here anymore. I
No.
want to jump in and
Something I said.
no, we can blame it on technology. So I was going to address a couple more questions that were here in the chat with Miriam and Graham and Sierra, but I'm just going to put myself off video and see if on the screen I can find Tamara. Hold on a sec. We'll be back. What I'm thinking is it could be the unfortunate possibility that she might have run out of battery power if she wasn't plugged in, but more on that soon. Else we may have to cut the rest of this session a little bit short. Oh wait, my video is not on, sorry. So I'll give it a minute to see if Tamara can jump back in on the call. And otherwise, if I have all of the comments in the chat, and I can forward these questions to Tamara, and maybe we can try possibly to offer thoughts on that. I'm not sure by what means, because right now it's the spontaneity of doing this over this Zoom. But my guess is perhaps Tamara ran out of juice on her computer. Okay, so everyone, I'd like to thank you all for your time and your participation. It's been really great, and stay tuned for more classes from NTS.
Thanks, Erica.
Yeah, my pleasure. Okay, I just letting you know, oh, it was a storm and a power surge. So there we go. So thank you everyone for attending. Have a great rest of the day. Be safe, be well, wash those hands. Okay, bye-bye everyone.
Thanks, Erica.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Goodbye.